There's a reason why narcissists fill every moment with noise, drama, and attention-seeking behavior. There's a reason why they surround themselves with admirers, create constant chaos, and seem incapable of sitting quietly with themselves. Carl Jung understood that for the narcissistic personality, solitude isn't just uncomfortable, it's absolutely terrifying, because it's the one place where their carefully constructed false self cannot survive. Jung spent decades studying what he called the inflated ego, the psychological condition where someone becomes so identified with a grandiose self-image that they lose all contact with their authentic nature. He discovered that narcissists are essentially people who have built their entire identity around avoiding one specific experience, being alone with who they really are beneath all the performance, manipulation, and desperate need for external validation. Today, I want you to understand why Jung believed that genuine solitude is kryptonite for narcissistic personality patterns, and why people with narcissistic tendencies will do absolutely anything to avoid the kind of quiet, honest self-examination that healthy people find healing and transformative. This isn't about demonizing anyone. It's about understanding how the narcissistic defense system works and why authentic solitude naturally dismantles it. And before we explore how Jung's insights reveal why narcissists unconsciously flee from solitude, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. I want to know, have you noticed how certain people in your life seem unable to tolerate quiet moments or being alone? Your observations might help others recognize these patterns. The first thing Jung understood about narcissistic personality patterns is that they're built on what he called the avoidance of the shadow, the unconscious rejection of any aspect of the self that doesn't fit with the grandiose self-image. Narcissists have typically experienced such early wounding around their authentic self that they've constructed an elaborate false persona designed to get the love, attention, and validation they couldn't receive by being genuine. But here's what Jung discovered about this false self. It requires constant external reinforcement to maintain itself. The narcissistic ego is like a balloon that constantly needs air pumped into it through admiration, attention, drama, conflict, or any form of emotional reaction from others. Without this constant supply of external validation, what Jung called narcissistic supply, the false self begins to deflate and the real self starts to emerge. This is precisely why solitude is so threatening to narcissistic patterns. In genuine solitude, there's no audience to perform for, no one to manipulate for attention, no external source of validation to maintain the inflated ego. Jung called this the desert of the real self, the psychological space where all pretense falls away and you're left with who you actually are beneath all the. For healthy people, this encounter with the authentic self is ultimately nourishing, even when it's initially challenging. But for narcissists, it's catastrophic because their entire psychological structure is built on avoiding this exact encounter. They've spent so much energy creating and maintaining a false self that the prospect of meeting their real self feels like psychological death. Number 1. Solitude forces narcissists to confront their own emptiness. Jung understood that beneath the grandiose presentations, the constant demands for attention, and the manipulative behaviors, most narcissists are dealing with what he called the wound of not being seen, a deep sense of emptiness and worthlessness that they've been running from since childhood. In solitude, without the distraction of other people's reactions and emotions, narcissists are forced to sit with this emptiness directly. They can't project their feelings onto others. They can't create drama to avoid their inner experience. They can't manipulate situations to generate the emotional responses that temporarily fill the void inside them. This confrontation with inner emptiness is precisely what Jung called the dark night of the soul. But while healthy people can navigate this experience and emerge stronger, narcissists typically flee from it because they've never developed the psychological tools to tolerate difficult emotions without external regulation. The narcissist in solitude discovers that without an audience, without someone to impress or manipulate, without external validation constantly flowing in, they feel like they don't exist. Jung called this the terror of non-being, the fear that beneath all the performance and grandiosity, there might be nothing substantial there at all. This is why narcissists often describe feeling bored or restless when alone, but what they're actually experiencing is what Jung identified as existential anxiety, the fear of confronting the emptiness that they've been avoiding through constant external stimulation and validation seeking. Write in the comments now, "I face my inner truth." Say it like you're declaring your willingness to encounter your authentic self, even when it's uncomfortable. Number 2, solitude eliminates the narcissistic supply that maintains their false self. Jung observed that narcissistic personalities are essentially addicted to what he called emotional reactivity from others. Any response that confirms their importance, specialness, or power to affect others' emotional states. This can be admiration and praise, but it can also be anger, frustration, fear, or even hatred, as long as it confirms their significance. In genuine solitude, this supply is completely cut off. There's no one to react to their stories, validate their superiority, or provide the emotional responses that temporarily inflate their ego. Jung called this the withdrawal symptoms of the false self, the psychological distress that occurs when narcissistic patterns can't find external sources of validation. This is why many narcissists can't tolerate being alone for extended periods without reaching out to someone, anyone, who might provide some form of attention or reaction. They might create unnecessary crises, send dramatic messages, pick fights, or manufacture emergencies, anything to re-establish the flow of external attention that their false self requires for survival. Jung understood that this desperate need for external validation reveals the fundamental insecurity beneath narcissistic grandiosity. The person who truly believes in their own worth doesn't need constant confirmation from others. The person who is genuinely confident doesn't require endless admiration to feel okay about themselves. But narcissists have typically never developed what Jung called internal validation, the ability to feel worthy and valuable based on their own assessment rather than others' reactions. This means that solitude, which should be a space for self-connection and inner peace, becomes a terrifying void where they feel like they're disappearing. Number 3, solitude prevents the projection that narcissists use to avoid self-awareness. One of Jung's most important insights about narcissistic patterns is that they rely heavily on psychological projection, unconsciously attributing their own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, and behaviors to other people, rather than taking responsibility for them. In interactions with others, narcissists can project their own selfishness onto others and call them selfish. They can project their own insecurities onto others and criticize them for being insecure. They can project their own manipulative tendencies onto others and accuse them of manipulation. This projection serves 2 functions. It allows them to express these disowned aspects of themselves while maintaining their grandiose self-image. But in solitude, there's no one available to receive these projections. Jung called this the mirror of solitude, the way that being alone forces you to own all of your thoughts, feelings, and impulses, rather than attributing them to others. For healthy people, this leads to increased self-awareness and personal responsibility. For narcissists, it's terrifying because it threatens to collapse their entire defense system. Without the ability to project their difficult emotions and unacceptable impulses onto others, Narcissists in solitude are forced to confront the reality of their own inner experience. They have to acknowledge their own anger, jealousy, insecurity, sadness, and fear without being able to blame these feelings on someone else's behavior. This is particularly challenging for narcissists because their grandiose self-image typically includes the belief that they're above ordinary human emotions and limitations. Being forced to acknowledge their own emotional volatility, neediness, and psychological pain contradicts the special, superior identity they've constructed. Hit like if you're ready to own your projections instead of blaming others, and subscribe if you want more insights into Jung's understanding of narcissistic defense mechanisms. Number 4. Solitude reveals the narcissist's inability to love authentically. Jung understood that genuine love requires what he called the capacity for otherness, the ability to see and care about another person as they actually are, rather than as extensions of your own needs and desires. But narcissistic personalities typically relate to others as narcissistic objects, people who exist primarily to serve their emotional needs, rather than as separate individuals worthy of respect and consideration. In solitude, this becomes glaringly obvious because there's no one available to serve these narcissistic needs. The narcissist can't manipulate anyone for attention, can't use anyone for emotional regulation, can't extract validation from anyone. They're forced to confront the reality that they don't actually know how to generate love, connection, or emotional satisfaction from within themselves. Jung called this the poverty of internal resources, the way that people who have become dependent on others for their emotional well-being discover in solitude that they've never developed the capacity for self-soothing, self-validation, or authentic self-love. They realize that all of their relationships have been essentially transactional, based on what others can do for them rather than genuine care for who others are. This recognition is devastating for narcissists because it means acknowledging that they've never actually loved anyone, including themselves. They've used people, manipulated people, extracted emotional resources from people, but they've never developed the capacity for the kind of selfless love that doesn't seek anything in return. For someone whose entire identity is built around being special, superior, and deserving of endless admiration, discovering that they're incapable of authentic love is perhaps the most crushing realization possible. It reveals that beneath all the grandiosity, they're emotionally impoverished and fundamentally disconnected from the human experiences that give life meaning. Number 5. Solitude forces narcissists to face their own mortality and limitations. Jung observed that narcissistic personalities often operate with what he called magical thinking, the unconscious belief that normal human limitations don't apply to them. They might believe they're destined for unlimited success, immune to consequences, or somehow exempt from the ordinary struggles that affect everyone else. In solitude, especially extended solitude, this magical thinking begins to crumble. Without the constant distraction of external drama and validation seeking, narcissists are forced to confront the reality of their own human limitations. They're forced to acknowledge that they're aging, that they've made mistakes, that they've hurt people, that they're not actually as special or superior as they've believed. Jung called this the collision with reality, the moment when grandiose self-perceptions meet the undeniable facts of ordinary human existence. For healthy people, this collision leads to what Jung called humble wisdom, the acceptance of limitations that paradoxically increases authentic power and effectiveness. But for narcissists, this collision is catastrophic because their entire psychological structure is built on the denial of limitation and vulnerability. Accepting that they're ordinary human beings subject to the same struggles and limitations as everyone else feels like the death of their identity rather than the birth of authenticity. This is why narcissists often have such difficulty with aging, failure, rejection, or any experience that contradicts their grandiose self-image. In solitude, these realities become impossible to avoid or deny, forcing a confrontation with truth that the narcissistic ego simply cannot tolerate. Write in the comments, "I accept my humanity." Say it like you're embracing your limitations as part of what makes you genuinely human, rather than trying to be superior to ordinary human experience. But here's where Jung's insight becomes particularly profound. He understood that this terror of solitude isn't just a personal psychological issue, it's a cultural problem that affects how narcissistic individuals impact their families, communities, and society as a whole. Jung observed that people who can't tolerate solitude typically become what he called emotional parasites, constantly seeking others to regulate their emotional states, validate their worth, and serve their psychological needs. They create what he termed narcissistic relationships, connections based not on mutual care and respect, but on one person's ability to provide narcissistic supply to the other. These relationships are exhausting for the non-narcissistic person because they're essentially being used as a human anti-anxiety medication, constantly required to manage someone else's emotional state while receiving little genuine care or consideration in return. Jung called this the tyranny of the needy ego, the way that people who refuse to face themselves in solitude end up enslaving others to their emotional needs. Understanding this dynamic explains why narcissists often seem to create chaos wherever they go. They're not consciously trying to make others miserable, they're unconsciously trying to avoid the inner emptiness that solitude would force them to confront. Every crisis they create, every conflict they initiate, every dramatic situation they manufacture serves to distract them from the inner work that solitude would require. And this is where Jung's analysis becomes both diagnostic and hopeful. He understood that the narcissistic avoidance of solitude isn't a permanent character flaw. It's a defense mechanism that can potentially be dismantled through what he called the gradual courage of self-encounter. Jung believed that even people with severe narcissistic patterns could potentially heal if they could develop the courage to gradually increase their tolerance for solitude and the self-awareness it brings. But this requires what he called the death of the false self, a psychological transformation so profound that most narcissists would rather continue their pattern of avoiding solitude than undergo the necessary dismantling of their grandiose identity. This transformation would require acknowledging that they've been wrong about fundamental aspects of themselves and their relationships, accepting responsibility for the harm they've caused others, grieving the authentic self they never allowed to develop, and learning to find meaning and value in ordinary human connection rather than in being special or superior. For most narcissists, this feels impossible because it requires temporarily feeling worse before feeling better, accepting limitation before finding authentic power, acknowledging emptiness before discovering genuine fullness. But Jung knew that this difficult process is the only path from narcissistic misery to authentic happiness. So if you recognize narcissistic patterns in yourself, if you've noticed that you struggle with being alone, or find yourself constantly seeking external validation, Jung would tell you that the very discomfort you feel in solitude is pointing toward your path to healing. The anxiety, emptiness, and restlessness that arise when you're alone aren't evidence that something is wrong with solitude. They're evidence that your authentic self is trying to emerge from beneath layers of false grandiosity. And if you're dealing with narcissistic individuals in your life, understanding their terror of solitude can help you recognize why they seem so desperately needy for attention, why they create unnecessary drama, why they seem incapable of genuine empathy or consideration. They're not choosing to be difficult. They're unconsciously running from the inner emptiness that solitude would force them to confront. The solution isn't to enable their avoidance by constantly providing narcissistic supply, but to maintain healthy boundaries, while perhaps encouraging the kind of therapeutic relationship that might help them gradually develop tolerance for self-encounter. But ultimately, Jung understood that narcissists must choose their own healing, and most will continue avoiding solitude rather than facing the profound transformation it would require. Write in the comments now, "I embrace authentic solitude." Say it like you're choosing the courage of self-encounter over the comfort of external validation and grandiose self-deception. This is Carl Jung's profound insight into the narcissistic condition. The understanding that the very thing narcissists most avoid, genuine solitude, is exactly what they most need for healing. Their greatest enemy is also their potential salvation, but only if they can develop the courage to face the emptiness, abandon the grandiosity, and allow their authentic self to emerge from the ruins of their false identity. If this analysis resonates with you, whether you recognize these patterns in yourself or others, you've found a community that understands the profound psychological courage required for authentic self-encounter. Subscribe to join others who choose the difficult path of genuine solitude over the exhausting performance of narcissistic validation seeking. Because when we understand why narcissists flee from solitude, we also understand why embracing authentic solitude is one of the most powerful acts of psychological courage and spiritual development available to human beings. In choosing genuine self-encounter, we choose authentic existence over grandiose performance, real connection over narcissistic supply, and the difficult beauty of human truth over the comfortable lies of inflated ego.